There's a particular kind of silence that happens right after someone shares something painful, and the other person responds by talking about themselves instead. You mention you had a rough week, and somehow within 30 seconds, they're describing their own rough month. It happens so smoothly, you almost miss it. I noticed this pattern years before I had a name for it, and once I saw it, I couldn't stop seeing it everywhere. At first, I assumed it was simple rudeness, the kind of thing you'd expect from someone who never learned basic manners. But that explanation stopped making sense the more I paid attention, because the people doing this weren't rude in any other way. They held doors open, remembered birthdays, and were genuinely kind in a dozen other situations. So why, in this one specific moment, did the conversation always seem to slide back toward them? He does this at dinner tables constantly, and almost nobody calls it out. Someone brings up a health scare, and within a minute, he's talking about the time his own doctor found something concerning. Someone describes losing a parent, and he's already reaching for his own story about grief. It isn't that he doesn't care, it's that something in him seems unable to simply sit inside another person's experience without connecting it back to his own. You may have noticed this in someone close to you, maybe without quite being able to articulate what bothered you about it. It isn't dramatic in any obvious way, and nobody in the room is shouting. There's no obvious selfishness on the surface, no refusal to listen politely and nod along. The conversation just keeps drifting, gently and consistently, toward one particular person's inner world. And you leave the exchange feeling strangely unseen, even though technically you were both talking the whole time. The simple explanation people usually reach for is narcissism, and I understand why. It's a tidy word, it fits neatly into a sentence, and it lets you file the behavior away as someone else's character flaw. But the more closely I looked at this, the less satisfied I became with that label. Because true narcissism, the clinical kind, is relatively rare. What I was watching happen at kitchen tables and church potlucks and hospital waiting rooms was something far more common and far more human. What surprised me most was how often this behavior showed up in people who seemed, by every other measure, deeply insecure. Not arrogant, not self-important in the way we usually picture that word. Quiet men, mostly, who'd spent decades being told to keep their feelings to themselves, suddenly unable to stop redirecting every conversation toward their own experience. That contradiction kept nagging at me, sitting there unresolved for weeks. If he was so unwilling to talk about himself in general, why did he seem almost compelled to do it here? I started watching more closely at family gatherings, the kind where 3 generations sit around one table and conversation moves in unpredictable directions. A grandmother mentions she's been having trouble sleeping. Within a minute, her son is explaining his own insomnia in detail, complete with the specific brand of medication he tried. Nobody intended for this to happen, it just happened. The way water finds the lowest point in a room, following some invisible slope nobody built on purpose. At first, this looked like a simple failure of empathy, and maybe on the surface it is, but that tiny detail, the way it happened even to people who clearly loved their families, explains much more than the empathy theory can account for. Because these were not cold people, and some of them would have given anything, quite literally, for the person sitting across the table.
Something else was driving this. Something underneath the surface behavior, and I couldn't let it go until I understood what. Here's where things started to shift for me. I began noticing that this redirection almost never happened during casual, low-stakes conversation. Nobody hijacks a discussion about weekend plans or what to have for dinner. It happens specifically when something emotionally exposed enters the room. Vulnerability, fear, grief, uncertainty. These are the exact moments the conversation suddenly bends back toward the self. Which meant the behavior wasn't really about ego at all. It was a response to something. And responses, unlike character flaws, have triggers worth understanding. think about what actually happens inside a person when someone else shares something painful. For most of us, listening to real vulnerability activates a kind of internal mirror. We start feeling an echo of what the other person is describing, some faint version of their fear or sadness rising in our own chest. For people who grew up in households where emotional expression wasn't safe, that echo isn't faint at all. It can be overwhelming, disorienting, even threatening in a way they can't fully name. And here's the quiet reason redirecting the conversation makes a strange kind of sense. Talking about his own experience, even unconsciously, gives him something to manage that he actually knows how to manage. Somebody else's raw grief is unpredictable and uncontainable. His own story, even a painful one, is territory he's already walked through and survived. Without realizing it, he isn't stealing the spotlight out of vanity. He's retreating to familiar ground, because unfamiliar emotional ground feels unsafe. That reframing changed everything for me, because it meant the same behavior that looks like self-centeredness from the outside might actually be a form of self-protection from the inside. Little by little, I started noticing this pattern in men who'd spent their working lives in environments that punished visible emotion. Military service, manual trades, corporate hierarchies where showing weakness meant losing standing. All the places where the unspoken rule was simple. Handle it yourself and don't make others handle it for you. You can watch this play out almost like clockwork at retirement gatherings, oddly enough. A man who spent 30 years being defined by his job suddenly has no professional identity left to fall back on. Conversations about his wife's worries or his neighbor's struggles start pulling toward his own uncertainty about who he is now. It isn't that he's suddenly become vain in his 60s, it's that the scaffolding that used to hold his sense of self just came down, and every emotional conversation now brushes uncomfortably close to that exposed structure. Eventually, I started noticing this in workplace settings too, in ways that were easy to miss if you weren't looking for the pattern specifically. A colleague describes feeling overwhelmed by a new manager's expectations. Someone nearby responds with an extended account of a difficult boss they once had, taking up most of the remaining conversation. On paper, it looks like empathy, an attempt to relate. In practice, the original speaker often ends up comforting the person who supposedly showed up to comfort them. And that's where everything begins changing and how I understood this. Because if the behavior is really about discomfort with unmanaged vulnerability, then it isn't only self-protective. It's also a way of avoiding intimacy without ever appearing to withdraw. He never leaves the room, and he never changes the subject to something unrelated. He stays right there, fully present, seemingly engaged, while quietly making sure the emotional center of gravity never settles too long on anyone else's pain.
Maybe you've done something similar without meaning to, in a moment when someone needed you to simply listen, and you found yourself filling the silence with your own story instead. Most people who do this aren't trying to dominate a conversation, they're trying to survive one. Silence after someone else's grief can feel unbearable if you were never taught how to sit inside it. Filling that silence with words, even the wrong words, feels safer than the alternative. The pattern deepens further once you look at what happens in marriages specifically. Marriage compresses years of these small moments into a relationship two people can't easily walk away from. A wife describes feeling lonely, unseen, exhausted from managing the household alone, and her husband, wanting badly to connect, responds by explaining how exhausted he's been too, how much pressure he's under at work, how nobody understands what he's carrying either. He isn't lying, and he probably is exhausted, but in that specific moment, what she needed was to be witnessed, not matched. And what looks to her like a husband who can't stop centering himself is often, underneath, a husband who has no other tool for connection except comparison. He was never taught to simply say, "That sounds incredibly hard," and then stop talking. Comparison is the only bridge he knows how to build. That tiny gap between witnessing and matching turned out to be one of the most important discoveries in all of this. Witnessing says, I see what you're carrying, and I'm not going to make this about anything else right now. Matching says, I understand because I've felt something similar, which sounds like empathy, but functions in practice as a quiet redirection. Most people who constantly make things about themselves have never learned the difference because nobody ever demonstrated it for them. Where would someone even learn it in the first place? Picture a boy growing up in a household where his sadness was met with "other people have it worse" or "stop feeling sorry for yourself." He doesn't learn that his emotions deserve uninterrupted space. He learns that emotional airtime is scarce, competitive, something you have to justify or earn through comparison. Decades later, sitting across from his own child's disappointment, some old reflex quietly reminds him that feelings are a limited resource and his are just as valid as anyone else's. This is where the unconscious fear underneath all of it finally starts coming into view, and it isn't vanity, it's closer to a fear of disappearing. If he doesn't insert his own experience into the conversation, some old part of him worries that his pain has never actually counted. It will simply go unwitnessed the way it always did growing up. Making it about himself isn't arrogance in that moment. It's a desperate, largely unconscious bid to finally be seen, using the only method he was ever taught. I started noticing how this shows up even in small-town life, in the kind of casual friendships built over decades of weekend gatherings and shared driveways. A neighbor mentions his son isn't speaking to him anymore, and the man across the fence responds with a long account of his own estranged relationship with his father. He means well, trying to say, you're not alone in this, but the man grieving his son walks away feeling like even his estrangement wasn't fully his own to hold. Church communities show this pattern too, in ways that can feel almost invisible because everyone involved is genuinely trying to offer comfort. Someone shares a private struggle during a small group meeting, hoping simply to be heard by people who trust each other, and one by one, the group responds with their own related stories, until the original struggle has quietly become a launching pad for 6 other people's unprocessed pain. Nobody meant harm. Everyone just reached for the only tool they had. Health appointments reveal something slightly different, something closer to fear management than connection. A man sits in a waiting room next to his wife before her procedure. Instead of asking how she's feeling, he starts talking through his own anxiety about hospitals, his own history with doctors, his own discomfort with the situation.
It looks self-absorbed from the outside, but from the inside, it's often panic with nowhere else to go, dressed up as conversation because silence feels even more frightening. Phone conversations expose this pattern with unusual clarity because there's nowhere to hide behind body language or change of scenery. A daughter calls her father to share good news about a promotion, and within minutes, he's talking about his own career, his own regrets, his own version of ambition. She hangs up feeling strangely deflated, unsure why sharing something joyful left her feeling smaller instead of celebrated. He hangs up believing the call went well, because in his mind, they connected. Little by little, all of these separate moments start revealing the same underlying shape. Family dinners, marriages, retirement, workplaces, small towns, churches, hospital waiting rooms, phone calls, different settings, different relationships, different surface behaviors. But underneath every single one, the same quiet mechanism keeps repeating itself. Someone reaches for comparison because they were never taught witnessing. Someone feels silence because silence once meant danger. Someone centers their own pain because they fear somewhere below conscious awareness that it has never truly been seen. That's the moment everything clicks into place. At least it did for me. This was never really about arrogance or attention or a lack of caring for other people. It was about an entire generation of people, mostly men, trained from childhood that vulnerability needed to be earned, justified, or matched rather than simply offered. Every dinner table interruption, every phone call that quietly shifted focus, every well-meaning story that stole someone else's spotlight, all of it traced back to the same unmet need, to be witnessed fully without having to compete for it first. Maybe you've been watching someone like this for years, quietly frustrated every time a conversation bent back toward them instead of staying where you needed it to stay. That frustration is valid, and nothing about this explanation erases the impact it has on the people around him. Understanding why someone does something doesn't obligate you to keep absorbing it without boundaries. But it might change how you respond the next time it happens, because you'll recognize the fear underneath the behavior instead of only the behavior itself. Or maybe, if you're honest with yourself, you've recognized some of this in your own reflexes. Maybe you've caught yourself mid-sentence, already turning someone else's story into your own before you even noticed you were doing it. That recognition isn't something to be ashamed of. It's information. It tells you exactly where the old training still lives inside you. And it gives you the first real chance to choose something different the next time silence asks something of you. If today's conversation explained why people quietly turn toward themselves in moments that call for stillness, there's a natural place this leads next. Because once you stop making a conversation about your own experience, a new discomfort often shows up in its place. It's the discomfort of simply sitting with someone else's pain, offering nothing but presence. That discomfort deserves its own exploration, because learning to witness instead of match turns out to be a skill almost nobody was ever taught, and almost everybody needs. I want to thank you sincerely for spending this time thinking through something this personal alongside me. If any part of this helped you understand someone in your life a little better, or helped you understand yourself, consider leaving a like. It genuinely helps more people find these conversations. I'd love to know, honestly, whether you recognized someone you love in any of this, or whether you recognized yourself. If thoughtful conversations like this one matter to you, consider subscribing, and I'll keep bringing you here to think alongside me.